Welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. My name is Ralph Cree. This is brought to you in association with bodyheartmindspirit.co.uk. In this episode, I spoke to my friend Kathryn, who was a Mormon for her entire childhood and a lot of her adult life. And then in 2020, she had this kind of awakening where she realised that Mormonism was all bullshit. And we talked about her life in Mormonism, the sort of things she used to believe in, and what the institution was like that she was brought up in, and what her experience was like seeing through it all and having this kind of awakening moment where she freed herself from Mormonism, and then now what her life's been like since leaving Mormonism. She is about to do a university degree in the psychology of coercive control, and she has already done a course with Steven Hassan, who is an expert on cults and cult levers. This was a very, very interesting conversation. She's had a fascinating life, and her leaving of Mormonism and the way it all fell apart for her was amazingly interesting. And I think learning from stories like Kathryn's can really help any person in life, no matter what walk of life you're in. We all fall prey to ideologies, get captured by them at different times, and we can become free of them. And then we become wiser, a bit more discerning the next time an alluring ideology comes along. So you can template these kind of stories onto your own life and see in what ways have you been captured by ideology and how can you become free of it. So I think this is a beneficial exercise for anybody to study cults and people who have left cults and how they left them, so I hope you enjoy. So Kathryn, welcome to the Evolving Spiritual Practice podcast. Hello. Nice to see you.
Hello. Nice to be here.
So we have known each other for a few years, and we were just hanging out talking one day, and I said I was going to go and watch The Book of Mormon, which is a musical that kind of takes the piss out of Mormons, made by the guys that did South Park. And you said, "Oh, right, oh, great! I'm going to go and watch that too." And then we got talking about things and Mormons and that, and you said, "Oh, I was a Mormon, and now I'm not." And then we had a very, very interesting conversation. So you've got a very interesting story of a life within Mormonism, and then this kind of, I might describe it as a kind of waking up out of the spell. And then a whole kind of post-Mormon life, a new kind of life, and that's what we're going to explore today. And for a couple of reasons. One is that it's very interesting. I mean, I don't know that much about Mormonism. I know a little bit, and I went on when I was at university, I went on a field trip to. They have like a genealogy centre in London, and I went there and that. And I've also watched some of the South Park. There's the guys from South Park made another very funny film called Orgasmo, which I recommend people watch, about Mormons. So what am I saying? So you've got this very interesting story of being part of this kind of fascinating world of Mormonism, which has got all sorts of strange and bizarre things, but also there's all sorts of reasons why people are are Mormons and continue to be Mormons, and we can explore all of that.
Mhm.
And the other thread is this kind of seeing through, well, just kind of popping your head outside and having a bigger perspective, and suddenly
Mhm.
realizing that what you've believed in your whole life isn't true, which is a very common theme for anyone who's interested in spirituality of any type, or atheism, or maybe you were spiritual and you become an atheist or whatever. It happens to people. And one of the things that is going to be a theme in this conversation is how people can get captured by ideologies, any type of ideology, a religious
Mhm.
ideology, political ideology, um, scientism as a ideology, and it can happen to anybody. And
Mhm.
so there's that too. So there we go. That's me kind of just setting the stage for our conversation. And probably a good place to start would be if you could just describe what Mormonism is to begin with, if you think that's a good
Okay.
place to start.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So it's always a bit tricky to describe it because I have my Mormon answer to that question and then my post-Mormon answer to that question.
Do
They're
both.
quite different, as you
Do
can
both.
imagine.
Yeah.
So as a member, as a Mormon, I would have said that we are a Christian group, or we were. Yeah, it's a Christian group. The basic belief is in Jesus Christ, that he lived, died, and was resurrected. And then on top of that, we also believe that, or we believed that Joseph Smith was called to be a prophet by Jesus Christ through a vision. He then received an ancient record in the form of gold plates, which he translated into English, and the religion was born. I would have also always clarified that there's one thing that sets us apart, and that's that we believed in three separate members of the Godhead. So God, Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost are three distinctly separate people, which obviously separates Mormonism from Christianity in quite a major theological way. But as a member, I would have always clarified with that point, because that's kind of the most important thing, I guess, for Mormons. So that's kind of that's the religious view of it, and what Mormonism is. This sort of Christian sect that believes in Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith as a prophet. And then on from that, there has been a continuous living prophet ever since until now. And there still is one. They still believe that there is a living prophet. And he speaks directly for God and tells everybody what they need to be doing. So that's kind of the religious point. I guess in my post-Mormon world, I would describe that quite differently. I no longer see them as being a Christian religion, despite the fact that they definitely have Jesus Christ at the center of what they believe in. And I do believe that most members do have that. And I think that that's really important to them. It was really important to me. I see that it's important to them. I don't necessarily see it as a Christian-based religion, because I think the prophet is more important than Jesus Christ. So it doesn't really matter what Jesus said 2,000 years ago. It matters more what the prophet's saying now, because he speaks for Christ now, according to them. So yeah, I think
What
that's
happens when so the prophet's a living person who's like the son of sort
correct.
of and what happens when they die? I mean, there must. So this is this
Yeah,
like an unbroken line back to Joseph
it is.
Smith in 18 whenever.
That's
When was
correct.
Joseph Smith alive?
He was born in 1804, I believe. He founded the religion in 1830. He claims to have had his first vision in 1820, depending on which version you read. There are actually multiple versions of that, despite what I was told. That was just one of the issues that I came across when I first started going kind of down that rabbit hole, really, was that there are multiple versions of that story, and they all kind of tell a different date. But yeah, roughly the church would tell you that he had his vision in 1820. He finally formed the church in 1830. So yeah, we're going back 200 years.
And then, so, you know, he had a successor, and then that person died, and they had a successor. Is it an
That's correct.
unbroken lineage then?
So, yeah, so he was martyred, is the best way to describe it. He died for his beliefs. Whether or not I believe that now, I don't know, but certainly that's what I was always taught. And then his successor was Brigham Young. He was the person that took them to Salt Lake City. So he was the one that crossed the plains and took them on their journey that most people that know anything about Mormonism will know about that, along with polygamy. That's the other big one. And it was always taught to me that it was Brigham Young that was polygamous. I've since found out that actually the first 7 prophets were polygamous. So that was quite an interesting thing to find out. So yeah, there's that sort of history of it. But yeah, the living prophet now is Russell Nelson. His name is Russell Nelson. He's 99, I believe now. So he speaks directly for God. When he dies, it will be Darlin Oaks who becomes the prophet. So that's actually already set in stone. You can predict that from one prophet to another. So providing that Darlin Oaks doesn't die before the current prophet, he will become the prophet.
Yeah, and I sorry, I interrupted you. You're halfway through your view of Mormonism as an ex-Mormon, how you would describe it now. So you say it's not you don't see it as a Christian tradition because the prophet is more important. What the prophet said is more important than what Jesus says.
Yes, I think that does separate them, and I would have never said that as a member. I would have died on the hill that it was a Christian religion, because Jesus Christ is at the center of everything that they do, and I think it does, and it kind of muddies the water a little bit. Actually, when I was still a member, when I was still believing in it all, I actually read an article entitled "Why Mormonism is the Fourth Abrahamic Religion," and that was actually a really interesting article, because it kind of separated it out from Christianity and Judaism and Islam into its own sector of Abrahamic faith. So Jesus Christ was still fundamental, as he is essentially to the Jews and the Muslims as well, but they have a different role for him to play. And in a sense, Jesus in Mormonism has a different role to play than he does in mainstream Christianity. That's how I saw it then. I still can almost see it like that now, that it is sort of a fourth Abrahamic group, but with its roots in Jesus. They do believe in Jesus. They definitely believe in Jesus.
Okay. And so in terms of your history with Mormonism and your life within it, what does that look like? I understand you were about 2 when your family... Yeah.
So it was actually just my mum. She joined the church when I was 2. That we didn't have any other family members who were members of the church. None of her family were. And yes, I was essentially raised in it. I always say that I was born and raised. I wasn't quite born, but I was definitely raised by the religion within it. My whole life was shaped by that, really. There was nothing before that in terms of my life, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I went through all of its programs. It has a program for children, which starts at 18 months, and that goes up to 3 years old. So I took part in that program. I then went into the children's program, which goes from 3 to 12, which is called primary. So I went through that program. Then they have a youth program, which goes from 12 to 18. It's actually changed. The ages have changed slightly now. It's kind of irrelevant, really, but those are the ages that I went through. So 12 to 18. And then 18 to about 30 is something called young single adults. I was only there for a short time because I got married, which is actually the idea. You shouldn't really get to 30. You should be married and gone into adulthood before that, is the goal. But yeah, 18 to 30 is young single adults, and then you sort of graduate through those programs. And they it's quite interesting, because I would have looked at it as a sort of form of continuing education. When I look back at it now, I don't think I learned anything in my 30s and 40s that I hadn't really learned in primary. There's no depth to it. It doesn't get any deeper than you learn in primary.
Right.
Which is also quite interesting, because that's not how you're taught it.
No. And so you said that in our previous conversation that when you were 12, there's this girls' youth program, and you described that as where the deep indoctrination took place for you.
Yeah, so that's where the rules start being read.
Yeah.
So up until that point, there's a lot of, you see somebody being bullied in the playground at school, what do you do? Or what would Jesus do? You stole a cookie from the cookie jar and your mum asked who it was. Do you blame your brother, or do you own up to it? Those sorts of moral, just life teaching things, really, all based on Jesus. What would Jesus do? Jesus loves you, all that kind of stuff. So that goes up to 12. At 12 in the youth program, that's really where the rules start being read. So we would regularly have to kneel on the floor on a Sunday to check that our skirts were below our knees. We were restricted in what we could wear, quite heavily restricted in what we could wear. Language was sort of drilled into us that you never use bad language. The sort of activities and the hairstyles that we were encouraged to have, not necessarily, we weren't like the FLDS where they literally have the same hairstyles. I think it's 4 hairstyles that they're allowed to have. We were allowed individuality, but it had to be modest. We could dye our hair, but it would have been frowned upon a little bit. So yeah, the rules started being read. It became weekly discussions about no sex before marriage. We would, as young women in particular, modesty was a huge thing. And we were regularly taught that if we were wearing something immodest, that the boys would not be worthy, because they would be thinking impure thoughts about us, and therefore their unworthiness would be based on our clothing choices or whatever. So yeah, that's where the indoctrination happens. And as an adult, I then read handbooks, because I was then called to teach, or asked to teach those classes for the youth and for primary. And often it would say things like, young people need to have a testimony of Jesus Christ before they leave youth, otherwise they're lost. So there was very much this sense of really drumming this stuff into us regularly. Lots of interviews with adults, which are highly inappropriate. I know now. I didn't think it at the time, but now I know that it would be highly inappropriate for any adult to ask a child about their sexual behavior, for example, to comment on clothing or anything really, that, just removing our individuality. So yeah, we would have regular interviews with men on our own. So that's really where I would call it brainwashing now. It's where the brainwashing took place.
And there's a lot of pressure that they were putting on you as young girls. It was like it would be your fault if you made the boys think impure thoughts. It's and
that was a big theme.
Like the boys are so weak spirited, and sort of imbeciles.
Yeah.
And you've got to hold it together. And you're responsible for not only the girls but also the boys.
That's right. Yeah. It's very much a patriarchal society, and I still kind of maintain now that I'm not entirely sure I was damaged by that in a long-term way. I don't feel less than because I'm a woman, and I never did, and I don't now. I more so from those comments, actually, I see the damage that it does to men. I think it's really interesting the harm patriarchy does to men. And I almost feel more passionate about bringing that to people's attention than I do about women, because I think women generally in society, if you live within a mainstream society, which I did, of course, because I lived in England, so there weren't very many Mormons. So yeah, I was pretty much raised in a secular world in that sense, and so women were equal essentially, and I never felt less than. But yeah, I look now at the role that the men played and the sorts of conversations that I had with men, both in youth and as an adult, and I see how damaging that is to otherwise really quite nice men. And yet they would do horrendous things, say horrendous things, because that's what they thought they were being told to do. So yeah, I actually see the patriarchy as being more damaging to men in many ways.
It's a bummer for everyone, frankly.
It is, completely. Yeah, and I think it's very easy to sort of look at women and see them as very downtrodden. You could do that in any society. You could look at Muslim men the same way and Muslim women the same way. You could look at Jewish men and women the same way. It doesn't matter who they are. Any society where any group of people is marginalized or not listened to or not respected, it's both parties that suffer because of that. Because everybody has their role to play in the world.
Well, we're all in it together. We're one big family.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
what's that saying? What's good for the goose is good for the gander, but the
That's
reverse
right.
is true. What's bad for the goose is bad for the gander.
Exactly. Definitely.
Yeah, and also you said that Jesus can see everything, and you can't hide your sins.
That's
Now,
right.
that must have been quite an oppressive state of mind to live in.
Yeah, and there's several parts to that. So there's the first part where where Jesus can see everything that we're doing. So we can't ever hide our secrets from Jesus, because he can see everything, including our thoughts. And that was a really big theme, was that he could also see our thoughts. So we had to think pure thoughts as
I just got to get in there.
Yeah,
Like,
go.
as someone who's I've been meditating for 30 years or something like that. I've looked at my thoughts in great detail. And I think this is true for most people. Most of our thoughts are utterly insane.
Yeah.
And the thought of particularly trying to get 12-year-old children to tame your thoughts and to make them presentable to the most pure person that's ever lived, and try to match it against them is that's an impossible task. How did you do? So with your thoughts as a 12-year-old?
Well, 12, 42, I don't think it makes much difference. I think it's fairly brutal as a suggestion goes. This idea that somebody can see your thoughts all the time is very oppressive. So yeah, there was that literal thought. So there was a period of time, for example, I think it was quite a short period of time, but as a child, so I would have been between 7 and 14. So I don't quite know how old I was. I just know where I was living, which is why I can age myself. But yeah, somewhere between 7 and 14. So pre-teen to early teen. And I actually took to showering in my swimsuit, because otherwise this old man was going to see me having a shower. And even that's relatively abusive. Yeah, that shouldn't happen, should it? That I'm that frightened of this thing in the sky that's watching me.
Wow.
Yeah, and I guess I reasoned that eventually, that he created my body. It didn't really matter what he saw of me, and it's fine. And so I moved on past that. But yeah, that was definitely an issue. But then there's also the secondary part of that, where priesthood holders, who are always male and always adults, also had something called the power of discernment. Now, I do think that discernment exists. I think that humans naturally can be discerning, and we make judgments on things all the time, and we don't walk down dark alleyways on our own at night, or whatever, just because, you know, it's just logic, and it is a sense of discernment. And I do think that we have that, and I think that we can read language in people's faces and their body language. We can just make decisions about things that are going on around us, and that's fine. What we were always taught the power of discernment was that these men could think like God. They were literally representing God or Jesus Christ, interchangeable, despite them being different people. But yeah, and they were literally representing these deities who could see everything. And therefore, when we couldn't lie to Jesus, we also couldn't lie to these men, because they would have been able to know. So there was also that fear hanging over us. And this is another point where really I kind of feel empathy for these men, because they were just men. Sometimes they were builders, sometimes they were lawyers, sometimes they were bankers, or whatever they were. And they were being put in rooms with these frightened teenagers and adults who were telling them all sorts of things that they didn't need to know.
Yeah.
With absolutely zero training on how to deal with that. They're not like Catholic priests or Church of England vicars. They're not trained in any way, shape, or form. They're just given this role and left to get on with it. And so, yeah, I think actually that was harmful to everybody, really, because we would sit in these interviews and just spill everything, things that didn't ever need to be discussed ever, because we couldn't lie. We wouldn't be able to lie. And if we did, the guilt then would take over. So people did lie in interviews all the time, but the guilt was quite extreme for some of those people.
Does it I mean, is suicide common among Mormons, or is that forbidden? I mean, what you're describing seems like the perfect circumstances for teenagers to have just had enough, and they're you know, the feeling of guilt and shame and the oppression and all of that. Yeah, I can imagine that driving people over the edge. But I also know that suicide is taboo.
Yeah,
With a lot of Christian sects.
so suicide would have been tragic. It would have been a tragic death. I guess people would have had different views on it. So I did have one friend who took his own life, and it was just tragic. And I know that his family had some things said to them that shouldn't have been said, and certainly that I think mainstream members would not have believed. Things like he wouldn't make it to heaven because he took his own life, and that's a sin. I don't know that most members would view it like that. But yeah, essentially it's not something that I don't know. It's difficult. I think it would just be a tragic thing. In terms of suicide rates, I don't know what the rates are here amongst Mormon youth. I know in very densely populated Mormon areas, suicide rates are high amongst LGBT youth.
Oh yeah, I suppose, yeah.
That's very common. It's often discussed. I don't know what the rates are though, so I can't comment on that precisely, but I know that it is an issue. Yeah.
I mean, and also a lot of this stuff you're describing, it seems like it's right on the edge of what's legal. And I'm surprised. I mean, so I watched a documentary years ago on Mormonism in America, and it was where they kind of have an actual kind of Mormon town, and they had they were practicing polygamy, which was against the law, but they just did it anyway. And I, you know, it seems with a lot of, can I call Mormonism a cult?
You can call it whatever you like.
Yeah, roughly, you know, whatever.
That, yeah.
Just as a kind of basket definition, that a lot of cults, they end up on the kind of right on the edge of things being legal and quite and do tip over the do illegal things, and kind of think they're going to get away with it, and often they do. And it's, I mean, I don't know, what do you know? I know that you've done some, you're now doing, you've done some study and some
Mhm.
courses, and you're doing a degree in all of this, which we'll get to. But this must be an issue with some of these practices, because what you're describing, I can just imagine children's services, for example, hearing that and thinking, well, that this isn't legal. And
Yeah. So there's various factors involved there. There is there's various movements going on at the moment, actually, and the church have just last week, I believe, updated their handbook, so that if you're an adult, you cannot be in a room on your own with a child. They've also recommended that adult leaders don't directly contact the youth. So it's a good step. That is. We used to do that all the time. We used to contact youth, particularly if their families were not members. We would contact them directly, to ask them if they wanted to lift somewhere or whatever. I never really considered it as an issue. I do now, but I didn't at the time, and I think most people wouldn't. In terms of this sort of interviewing that used to take place, I've actually had some therapy with a cult therapist, a post-cult therapist. And when I told him about the sort of interviews that I'd had, he said, I'd actually be struck off if I asked that question. So we would be regularly asked every 6 months as youth whether we masturbated, for example. It's completely irrelevant to the world whether we did or not. No teacher, no doctor, no therapist, no one would ever ask a child that question,
no,
unless there was a physical need to, like they were harming themselves
medical
somehow,
thing,
or
yeah.
in which case a doctor might, or a psychologist might, but they would be specially trained to ask that question and deal with whatever the answer is.
I
And so I
saw
think that's the key.
I saw a meme a few years ago, and it was like a kind of, it was a shot of the Earth, and then it zoomed out. You had the solar system, and then the galaxy, and then a kind of cluster of galaxies, and then the next shot was a great big Jesus with his fingers out saying, "Don't masturbate."
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it was a good
that's right.
one.
And of course, we couldn't lie. We couldn't lie about
Yeah,
it. People did, but then the guilt would eat them up.
yeah,
So yeah, but lying about it wouldn't have been acceptable, because obviously, well, there's 2 points to that as well. One, my guess is that any adult would know that you were lying.
yeah,
um, but also that idea that they are representing Jesus Christ,
yeah.
and therefore, that you wouldn't be able to lie about it for that reason either. So yeah, those sorts of, that level of control over your thought process is quite phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I think something that I always recognized was there, but saw it as a safety thing rather than a negative thing now as an adult. And even as a member, we actually, when our own children turned 12 and started being interviewed, we actually refused to allow them to be interviewed by an adult on their own. So even as active believing members, my husband and I had already sort of determined that that was not going to happen. We remembered those questions, that sort of level of questioning from when we were in youth, and we didn't like it. We didn't want that to happen to our children. So people are already moving on from that a little bit, and I know that bishops now, they're the local leaders, and it's no longer suggested that they ask that question. There is still a serious sin question, and everybody knows that the serious sin is sex, so that would still come into it somewhere. So what would happen in that situation is that all the lessons about sex before marriage would be, this is a very serious sin, this is a sin next to murder, this is, the most serious sin that you can commit. And then you would sit in this interview and they would say, do you have any serious sins that you need to disclose? So they don't necessarily ask you directly anymore, but it's still implied that those things need to be discussed.
It's incredible that's a sin right up there next to murder.
Oh yeah, it's definitely right up there next to murder.
Yeah.
It is a very serious sin.
Yeah, which is, and I suppose, I think the other thing I remember from this um, documentary, I think girls were getting married very young in this documentary. It's a long time ago. I saw, but you know, in the old days, people used to get married very young, but now I imagine in Mormonism in the UK, people get married at the kind of regular ages that people do, and to go through your entire teenage life with all of millions of years of evolutionary biology pushing you towards wanting to have sex as a teenager, and that being framed as a sin on the same level as murder, the emotional, the physical, emotional, and cognitive dissonance that you must experience is just tremendous. I mean, it's
because then on your wedding night, then you have to have sex.
Yeah.
It's almost like it is actually essentially a commandment, and of course, marriages legally, any marriage, regardless of religion, can be dissolved if it's not consummated. So there is that sense that kind of once you're married, you have to have sex, whether you want to or not. And having to switch from it being a sin to being a commandment is
literally
it messes with your head a little bit.
Minutes later, it's like,
That's right.
as soon as the rituals done, it's like within minutes. Wow.
9:50 not allowed. 9:59 is a commandment.
Commandment.
It is a bit mental.
Wow. Okay, and then the other thing. So I think in this period we're still talking about, as a kind of young lady, you were basically told that your role in life was to get married, and have babies.
Yeah. That was my role. Yeah. So I also, of course, had to have a good education. So Mormons do separate themselves from some religious sects. Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, are not particularly well educated. They don't want them to be educated because that leads to issues. We were actually actively encouraged to be educated. And so that was always very important, because if our husbands died or financial needs occurred, then we were encouraged to have a level of education where we could work if we need to support our families. So that I'm glad for that education was still a thing. So
obviously you were in conventional school and all of that the whole time.
Yeah, that's right. And I went post 16, so I got my GCSEs. I stayed on, did my A levels, went to university. So I did all of that before I got married. So I'm kind of sort of semi glad for that now. I never did work with my degree in the end, but that's by the by. I did get an education, and we were always encouraged to do so. Now I think, because I got married 20 years ago, and relatively we were still able to buy a house on one income, just about, at that point. Now I think that's impossible, and most women now would work in the church, and that's okay. That would not be frowned upon. It would not be seen that they were less than. In fact, if anything, it would be encouraged, because then there wouldn't be a burden on anybody. So
there's an interesting kind of competition between education, having access to education and a wide source of information, and then also this very restrictive worldview that you've been indoctrinated in. You'd think that seeking education and learning in different fields might be a threat to that.
I think it is. I think it is seen as a threat. So there's also a church education system. So we would have that alongside whatever else we were doing. So from 14 to 18, we had a daily scripture study class that we would attend. So that was also there. So that indoctrination kept it was a daily part of our lives. Post 18, there's also a scripture study course that people take part in. Of course, the boys go on their missions for 2 years. So there is definitely still an ongoing religious indoctrination going on in the background. I remember very clearly, it was my A-levels, and we studied the rise of the American West. So the sort of the pioneer era and the gold rush and the Indian Wars, of Native American Wars, I guess is what I should say now. Yeah. And all that kind of stuff we studied, and that is very much within the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon is supposed to be a story of the Native Americans, what we would now call the American, or no, what we called then the American Indians, the Native Americans. They are represented in the Book of Mormon, so it's kind of their history. But also, the sort of settlement of the West was very much through a Mormon lens for me. So all the pioneers were Mormon, because that's what I was taught about. The covered wagons that you see pictures of, everybody was Mormon, because that's what I was always taught. And it was very interesting to me, because when I was doing my A-levels, there was a book that I was given to read, and in there, Mormons were mentioned in like half a sentence. Some pioneers that were going west were heading to Salt Lake City or something, really, not mentioning them at all, really. And I just sat there and went, well, the book's wrong then. They don't know anything. Yeah. Clearly, all of the people going west were Mormon. And so, basically the religion was ring-fenced. Anybody that challenged that was wrong, and they were correct. So it didn't matter what it was, that continuously happened. So education was secular. Anything that challenged the belief was ignored as wrong. So it was quite easy in a way to just go, well, obviously that's not correct.
Yeah. Okay, I can see how that works.
It could be seen as a threat, but not really, because they indoctrinate you so well that it's not really a threat.
Yeah. And then, so we mentioned polygamy, and you said that at a certain point your family became an eternal polygamous family.
That's correct.
Like, what does that mean? When I hear that statement, I mean, I just don't understand that.
Okay, so the program that you're describing that you saw a few years ago sounds very much like it's about the FLDS, not about Mormons.
Yeah, so that's the...
So they're the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. Yeah. They still practice polygamy. They're the ones with the strict hairstyles. They, so they practice a very different kind of Mormonism. The mainstream church, as in the Salt Lake Church with the temples and the thing that I belong to, the group that I belong to, actually polygamy was sort of outlawed, I guess, in about 1890, although I think it carried on in practice beyond that, because there were polygamous marriages that existed, and so they didn't just dissolve, they were allowed to continue. Some also went to Canada and Mexico, and it was continued there as well. So there was a slight continuation post 1890, but not so much. However, polygamy as an eternal principle still very much exists within Mormonism, and it's very patriarchal, as polygamy always is, because there's polygamy, which is always patriarchal in nature, and then there's having relationships with whoever you want to have relationships with, which is a very different situation where people are equal. And so
this isn't polyamory.
No. This is very definitely polygamy, and men choose women that they are going to marry, and that was always the way it was done, right from Joseph Smith. He chose all his wives. He has like 42 wives, I believe. Brigham Young had 50 something wives, so some of them were really very polygamous. Later on that dropped to sort of 3 or 4, but either way.
Did they have a lot of children?
They did have a lot of children, and of course that's one of the major reasons why the religion became so well grounded and so widespread, because Brigham Young took them to Salt Lake where nobody else lived except some Native Americans that they got rid of fairly quickly. But yeah, and they were able to just populate. They had baby after baby after baby, and so yeah, that's why it became what it is today, with so many members still there, because a lot of them come from polygamous groups at the beginning.
Right.
But yeah, so polygamy as an eternal principle still exists. So men whose wives have died are able to take on an extra wife or another wife, but she will not. So anybody can do that. You know, you would be able to do that. My husband would be able to do that. Legally, you can do it. But also, we have something called sealings, which is like the eternal marriage part. So one of the big tenets of Mormonism is the families are continuous. So families go on forever and ever in their earthly state. So parents are still married, children remain their children, and it goes all the way back through time. And so yeah, men are able to have more than one wife in heaven. And so that then happened to my family, and I loved it. That's what's, I guess, quite unusual about me. A lot of women in the church do not like it, don't want to be in polygamous marriages. I accepted that completely. I was completely happy with it. I was completely happy with the fact that my husband might do that. That if I died, he would marry again, and we would all be one big happy family. Or that after we're all dead, that he would take on additional wives, because that's also a doctrine that women who didn't have the opportunity to be married in this life would be given to men in the next. So yeah, and I loved it. I loved that principle. I'm unusual in that.
Fascinating. So when you say your family became a polygamous family, your father, this is but your father wasn't a Mormon.
No. So this is my mum. She married a man whose wife had died.
Right. So then you had two mums, your biological mum,
yeah, I never knew her. Yeah, I never knew
one that was in heaven.
Yeah, essentially that's how it was. But
so what was your relationship like with your heavenly stepmom? I mean, what in real?
I never had one.
No. Well, no, but I mean, do you actually, in those kind of scenarios, what is your relationship like with that member of the family, so to speak?
She was always going to be there in the next life, but she was not part of my earthly life and my earthly existence. I didn't really, so I knew about her. There were pictures of her in the house, but you'd kind of expect that anyway. They were married for a long time. They were married for 45 years, I think, maybe even longer than that. And so you kind of expect to have her still talked about and discussed. So yeah, she didn't really feature beyond the fact that he'd been married before for a very long time. She died, and then he married my mum. So no, she didn't really feature, and I never really considered it, other than she was always going to just be a part of their lives. So I guess she is still part of my mum's life more than she ever was mine.
Right.
So, yeah. So she didn't feature really, no. Okay. But in terms of the fact that I could live eternally because my mum had married this man, that was what I loved. So it was giving me a ticket to heaven.
Okay.
Right. But I guess in a way
before that point, you were not destined for heaven.
No, not the highest. Not the highest kingdom in heaven. No, we wouldn't.
They've got different layers of heaven.
Oh yeah, there's different layers of heaven.
Okay, so wait, if you're a Mormon child, let's say you're 12, you're a Mormon, you don't have a one of these eternal polygamous families yet. Where are you told that you're going when you die?
You are told, okay, so if you're a woman, you can get married. So I would have, as a child, I would have always known that at some point I would get married, and then I would be able to get to this
But
highest
let's say a 13-year-old child died.
Yep. So
Then what
they
happens?
would, yeah. So this is where family history comes in. You went to the Family History Centre up in London. Family
Yeah.
history, huge for Mormons. It would be done posthumously for everybody. That work would be done in temples on their behalf after they're dead. So it would be that it would probably have to wait until, or we would definitely have to wait until her parents died or their parents died, and then that work would be done. So
What do they look at what all the ancestors had done and kind of weigh up all the merit and that kind of
yeah,
thing?
yeah. So everybody's just sealed together. That's what they're doing when they do family history work. They are essentially tying these family groups together.
So, and that's an enormous lot of pressure for a person to think that the merit they get in this life determines what happens to their great grandchildren. You know, and
Yeah,
is that a thing? Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. It's absolutely a thing. Yeah, your responsibility for not necessarily your onward generations, because they get to make their own decisions. So that's very much a thing, I guess, that we were responsible for teaching our children, but what happened after that would be up to them. Your responsibility for your ancestors was huge. So marrying everybody together, sealing everybody together, sealing children to parents, sealing husbands and wives together, that was an enormous sense of responsibility, because that has to go through, and you can't, there's a hymn that says that you can't be saved without your dead. So there's definitely a responsibility there for doing that work and making sure that everybody all the way back is all sealed together. So yeah, that happens. So if you were a child, you would eventually be sealed to your parents. If you were an adult, you might be sealed to your spouse if you were married. So for me, growing up, I would have always known that I was going to be married. So I would have always made that target in the end anyway. But of course, my mum wouldn't. So she would have then been given to a man in the next life. So yeah, that would have happened at some point. That it all gets sorted out. So if you're righteous, you're going to get there,
Okay.
regardless. But you need a man. If you're a woman, you have to have a man to get there. You can't get there on your own merit.
Wowzers. Okay.
Yeah. So that's quite crucial, I guess. Is that yeah? So a woman can be as righteous as she can be, and like the best Mormon you could ever be, but you're not getting into heaven without a man.
Yeah.
You're either going to be given one, or you've got to choose one.
Yeah. Wow. That's full on. There's the picture it's painting for me is just a situation where there's just a lot of pressure on people
Yeah.
to live up to these ideals and this kind of all the levels and codes and rules and yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And of course now, with my Mormon hat on, I've now broken that chain for our family. So there's a little like bit of Mormon law, I guess, that says law as in LORE, that says that there will be well, you don't want an empty place at your table. So the idea that you have your whole family gathered together in heaven and everybody's going to be there, but you don't want any empty chairs. So you want everybody to be there. With my Mormon hat on now, I'm now the empty chair, or my chair will be empty. I won't be there now. I can't be there. Even if the whole thing was true, I wouldn't choose to be there. So yeah, there's a name for that. It's anti-theist, but we can go into that later on because that's, I guess, my spiritual journey, rather than the sort of physical one. But yeah, so I will now be an empty chair at my family's table, if it's all true, which it isn't.
Okay, so and then when you were you said that the temple became very important for you, and I'm not you've mentioned the temple a few times, and I'm not entirely sure what the temple is.
Okay, So the temple is the pinnacle of the religion. So that's where you go to make sacred covenants. So we go there and we make promises. We're sort of taught or led to believe, I guess, and taught, and it's hinted at that you're making those covenants with God. Having properly studied those and looked at them, even the wording doesn't really allude to that. But it's not what we were taught. And so, yeah, so basically you make all these promises with God that you're going to be everything that the church wants you to be. Those promises include giving everything that you have, your time, talents, money, even your life. It was when I went to the temple, I actually covenanted to give my life. You don't anymore, but that's another issue, is that it changes, relentlessly changes. So yeah, there's those. So that was one of the covenants that I made. Another one was that I would keep the law of chastity, and the law of chastity is very clearly defined as being sex between a man and a woman who are married to each other. So there's no leeway for LGBT people in there at all. There's I can't think what the others are now. It's been a long time.
So
yeah.
the money one. So money's often a feature of cults and organisations like this.
Yeah.
And there's a percentage of your income you have to give, or what's the deal?
Yeah. So we give 10% of our income in the scriptures, actually, in the modern day scripture, if you want to call it that. So the modern day revelations of Joseph Smith, it actually says increase. And that has now been clarified by the Living Prophet to mean income, which isn't quite the same at all, because your increase is your increase. If you have 10 chickens and they lay 10 eggs, your increase is 10, not 20. But
capital gains in modern.
Yeah, you would now pay on your 20.
Yeah.
That you would now be expected to pay on that, because obviously it's changed, and your income and your increase are slightly different now in terms of sort of how we earn money and things now. So I kind of understand where they're coming from on that. But so yeah, 10% is the tithe, the same as most other sort of religious groups have a tithe. That is actually a commandment, and we are asked that question every year, sometimes twice a year. So we have to be paying our tithing to go to the temple. If you're not going to the temple, you're not going to be with your family forever. So there's definitely is a thing to pay your tithing.
I mean, how do they get evidence that people are paying? I mean, do you have to present your tax returns and things
No,
like that?
so they don't. They take it on word. That then would come back to this power of discernment, and the fact that the person that's interviewing you is representing Jesus Christ. So if you're lying about it, then you're lying to Jesus, and he knows. Yeah, so they would all come back to that. So there's a lot of honesty, I guess, in that. I guess there are some situations where bishops would know. So if you were driving around in your Ferrari and you were living in your multi-million-pound house, but you were saying that you weren't paying any tithing, so they can see what you're paying. They don't know what percentage of your income that is. But if you were then to say, actually, I didn't earn anything this year, so I haven't paid any tithing, they might question that. But yeah, essentially, they don't know. No, it's based on honesty.
Okay, and then so you you went to university and did some student lifestyle things. And then when you finished university, moved back home, confessed your sins to
multiple times over to various men.
And then met your husband.
That's correct. He's 3 years younger than me. I don't want to talk about him in the past tense. He's very much still here. But yeah, he was a returned missionary. He was righteous to the core. I now know he wasn't. He never was. He still isn't, according to them. But yeah, so we got married. He was just straight off his mission, so he was just 21 when we met. And he was 22 by the time we got married. I was a little bit older because like you say, I'd gone to university. I'd actually been traveling as well. I'd worked for a couple of years, so I did have. I was a bit older when we got married. I was 25 when we got married. So yeah, I married him because he shows some vague interest in me, and he was a good man. And that was really it at the time. He knows that. I can speak openly about that. And marrying for love, I guess it was encouraged, but there was definitely this sense that just because you love someone doesn't mean it's right to marry them. It would be better to marry a righteous person than somebody that you're just passionate about. So yeah, there was a little bit of that in there. So I loved him, obviously, and over 20 years that has developed and changed, and it is nothing at all relative to how it was 20 years ago. Yeah, and so yeah, we got married, and that was that. Yeah, and I stopped confessing my sins at that point because I didn't have any, I guess.
Yay. And then you, interestingly, both started to become skeptical of Mormonism at the same time, but independently, as far as I can remember from you, what you were telling me.
That's correct. So I guess we're skipping about 17 years there.
Okay. Well,
sorry. Can I pull you back a little bit? Just
whatever you want to talk about. Then
the only reason I'm going to pull you back just a little bit, because we can go to that, and that's fine, and it needs to be where it goes. But what you also need to understand is that once we started having children, so we had children very quickly, and we had 5 of them. Once we started having children, that was the point at which the real deep indoctrination happened to me. So I felt the absolute weight of being a mother and being the person that had to teach the children, because that's what I'd always been taught was my role. So my role was to be a wife and a mother, and to take my children with me to the highest kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
And so that level of responsibility married me to the church then, because there was no other possible way to raise children. I had a wonderful handbook that told me exactly what to do, what to say, outlined weekly lessons for my children. It outlined scripture study for them. Everything was about the church. It all became very, very intense. And I suffered with what I now know was religious scrupulosity, which is a form of OCD. And I look back through my life and I can see OCD all the way through my life. I have it in the form of health anxiety now. And definitely the religious scrupulosity was huge. These very dark thoughts about what would happen if I didn't read the scriptures that night, or if I didn't prepare a lesson, or if I didn't get everybody to church wearing shirts on time, if I wasn't being exactly perfect in my thoughts. So things like if I swore in my head, I would be on my knees crying for hours over that, because I was no longer worthy to take my children to heaven with me. So that sort of depth of religious conversion really took place once the children started being born. And the reason I wanted to take you to that point was because I think everybody needs to understand just how deep that went, and how many hours I would spend on my knees begging for forgiveness for being human, for not cooking dinner on time, for not ironing a shirt until it was Sunday morning, because that was a sin. These sorts of things consumed my every thought. My husband, however, it didn't. And that was another issue to me, because he wasn't as righteous as I thought he was. He wasn't as scrupulous as I was. He wasn't as intensely married to it as I was. So it actually caused some problems for us, because I didn't think that he was going to be with us because he wasn't doing what he was supposed to do, and then I wasn't doing enough to get him there. So there was a lot of that going on all the way through that period of time. Really for about 16 years of our 20 married years.
Yeah.
I was highly intense like that.
Well, you know,
With fear. It was fear. The whole thing was fear driven.
Yeah. Well, what comes to mind is that's actually the story of a lot of people that get into spirituality, meditation, health and wellness, yoga.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people have these, I suppose you might call it in Freudian terms, a kind of super ego. There's just a very harsh parent, which is
Yeah.
like a slave driver.
Yeah.
But you've got internalized and it's become a sub personality within you.
Yeah.
And I can see it in my own life. Being interested in the health and wellness and meditation and those kind of things. And I suppose, you know, my version of it would be, if I do these things, then I'll be enlightened, and that's basically this, like going to heaven, you know.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And so, you know, I can recognize it in my own life, and I can see it in the lives of a lot of other people and whole movements, you know, and out in the culture. So I'd say it's a very common phenomenon for humans to experience, whether they're religious or not. And I mean, it's not even uniquely contained within the health and wellness and spirituality religious circles. It's actually a very common human experience. And
it is. Yeah.
It sucks. It's absolutely horrible. And some people have the great benefit of recognizing that at some point in their life, and they're like, yeah, and you kind of suddenly stop cowering beneath the whip of this awful figure that's this, you know, sub personality inside yourself. And and it's a great opportunity to, and the relief you feel, it's a bit like a boat, the thought that you get a kind of a compensatory force, that the more oppressed you've been psychologically, but in these kind of situations, once that is recognized and seen, the kind of swing back is enormous, and you get this massive sense of relief of like, oh God, thank you, know, I'm so glad that I'm not, you know, doing that anymore. So that's one of the kind of the nice things, the way the ones, you get this compensation of enormous relief once you see through that and work through it. But it's a lifetime's work, honestly, for most.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, one of the things that I've often said is one of the things that makes me quite sad in a way is when I hear post-Mormons mostly, but post anything, post-trauma, I am now finally who I'm meant to be. I'm like, that makes me really sad. So I'm not. I was already there. So as a member, I'd gone through every single step I had to go through. I was just enduring to the end at that point. Nothing really was going to change in my life. Now, in 5 minutes or in 5 years, I could change entirely from who I am, and I'm not meant to be anyone other than right now. This is me right now, and I am free to explore every part of life that I want to explore. That's, you know, safe to do so, if you like. And I think I don't want to be the same person in 5 minutes or 5 hours or 5 days or 5 years. I don't want to be that same person anymore. I want to continuously be changing. And I think that's actually been a really big part of my journey, is this idea that I'm not meant to be anybody. There's no predetermined Kathryn that I'm finding in myself. And I guess it can often be said, lots of people would say it particularly if they're in the LGBTQ spectrum, or if they were in a marriage that was unhealthy, something like that. They'll often say it then. And I kind of understand where it comes from, that this idea of anything being finite now actually is not a fun idea to me.
Yeah.
I don't want to be that anymore.
And from my point of view, I'm not really that interested in enlightenment. When I used to be, thinking that enlightenment would be this kind of end to everything,
Yeah, that's right.
some kind of final release. And
Yeah.
my view nowadays, although this will probably change, because of what we're saying,
Yeah.
I see a life's trajectory of just continual evolution and metamorphosis.
Yeah.
And I think it's not a worthy goal to have some kind of grand finale.
No.
Yeah.
No, I think that can continue on post-death as well. I kind of feel like that's going to continue on post-death now. I don't believe in the resurrection anymore. I don't believe in a sort of standard Christian life. I guess if I'm anything, and I'm not, but if I was to put myself anywhere, it'd be closest to Shinto. I think this idea that there's sort of spiritual life in everything. And I really like the idea that energy and matter can't be created or destroyed. And as I'm both energy and matter, that's just going to continue. I'm going to become the roots of a tree that are going to create oxygen, that helps water to flow, that I could become anything really. I can become any part of life. And I love the fact that I kind of almost feel more connected to my ancestors now than I did when I was doing all this intense family history work as a member. I kind of look out the window and almost imagine that they're there still, and that there's some kind of spiritual energy about them, because that hasn't ceased to exist. It still exists. So yeah, that's kind of where I sit now.
Yeah.
Who knows?
But it might change.
5 minutes. I might do something else in a minute.
It's interesting that a lot of the indoctrination, if we might call it that, in Mormonism is very abstract. There's this sort of sense of the layers of heaven and all these things with the ancestors and things. And now what you're describing is a much more intuitive and direct experience of that connection. Whereas when it's all codified in these kind of lists of rules and this stuff, it's a kind of abstraction from your own direct experience.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I guess sort of moving on now. So that I needed everybody to sort of understand that intensity of how much I believed it.
Yeah, sure. I didn't mean to brush over that.
No, not at all.
We don't
but
need to.
It leads very nicely. This whole conversation leads very nicely into how I ended up where I am now, sitting here talking to you about it. Because one of the very first things that happened to me was that I had an experience. Well, I guess going back through life, I had lots of experiences with lots of different things. But I had an experience when I was about 21, I think I was, maybe 22. And I went to Hong Kong, and on Lantau Island, just outside of Hong Kong, there is a massive gold statue of Buddha. And it's up 149 steps or something. Is it 149 steps to enlightenment? I don't know what they are. I can't remember. There's something like that. It's a long way up. Whatever it is, there's a lot of steps. It could be like hundreds. I've got no idea what I'm talking about. But anyway, I climbed up these steps. And we actually broke through the clouds, couldn't see the Buddha from the ground. We walked up through the clouds, and then this Buddha was at the top. And I had a really profound spiritual experience up there, where I felt closer to what I described as God at the time, because that's what I understood it to be. And I couldn't understand why I was having this profound spiritual experience at a Buddhist religious site. And that, I was 21, it was before I got married, it was before I had the religious scrupulosity, but that kind of always stuck with me, this idea that spirituality and religion are somehow separate. And I was always able to sort of separate out those two things, and understand that everybody has some kind of spiritual experience, and it could be different for everybody, and it leads them to believe whatever they believe, and that was all okay. And I felt quite strongly that while the church was the only truth, that everybody else also had truth, and that their truth was just as valuable, and it all came from the same place, that it all came from God. So fast forwarding, I guess about 16 years into my marriage, I started to really study other religions. I became quite fascinated by other religious views. I went and visited Buddhist places here in the UK and in the US. I went to mosques. I made friends with Islamic people who were very religious. I made friends with other Christians. I spent time in cathedrals in Spain. I spent a lot of time having these spiritual awakenings, experiences in other religious buildings. And interestingly, I was having less and less and less within our own buildings. So at the church that I went to, I was just going, it was very busy. I was always very busy. I was always in the middle of everything. I always had a job to do. I had 5 children to teach. It was very, very busy. I wasn't having any sort of spiritual experiences there. I never liked the temple. The temple is sort of supposed to be the pinnacle of spiritual experience. I never had a spiritual experience in the temple ever. I never liked it there. I now know why, but I didn't at the time. And yet I would go to these Buddhist temples and have these incredibly spiritual, meaningful experiences and be completely confused by that. And so I managed to create around myself this omnist environment where everybody had truth. And it all pointed to Mormonism being the one truth. And that everybody else also had truth, but we were the only correct ones on the earth. So I kind of got to that point. And this whole conversation started because you mentioned that Travis and I went on kind of parallel journeys without even knowing it. I'd spoken to him about this and expressed this because I kind of felt quite passionate about it. And he actually at that point called me an apostate, which was deeply offensive to me at the time. I kind of wear it as a badge of honor now, but at the time I was very upset about that and needed to kind of bring myself back. So the scrupulosity really became very deep at that point, because I was questioning whether or not I was correct and all sorts of things. It was very, very messy couple of years. And that then led us to going to America, which was really the catalyst point for me. So I don't know whether you're ready to move on to that now.
Yeah,
that part of my
that's
story.
good.
Basically what happened was my grandma died and left us some money, and we decided that as a whole family, my mum came as well, we decided that we wanted to take the children to the historical sites of the church, because we wanted them to have a real deep understanding and testimony of where the church started and what it was all about. So we decided, and the other thing I'd always wanted to do was drive coast to coast across America. So we decided to put the two together, and we picked up a car in New York City and we drove all the way to Los Angeles, taking in various church history sites. And at the very first one that we stopped at, I stood there and I was like, but that's not what happened. And I had to immediately push that aside. I was like, well, of course it happened, because it just happened. But I had this quite profound feeling that what they were telling me at this site was not what happened. And then we went on to the next one, and the same thing happened again. And the next one again. And the next one again. And I was like, this is whitewashed history. Something else happened here, because it definitely happened. You know, the story, the people were real. All the stories actually existed, and there's evidence of all of those people. So the buildings still exist. They were real people that lived in that time. It's not as historically inaccurate as the Bible, perhaps, where there's, you know, pretty much zero evidence that Abraham existed, for example, in terms of sort of physical evidence of his existence. There is definitely physical evidence of these people's existence. They existed, they had these experiences, and the church was created 200 years ago. This is modern history. But as I was standing in these places, I was thinking, but these things are taught as absolute truths, and yet I don't think they are. So how do I find out what the truth actually is? Because this is so modern, there must be a way of me finding out what actually happened. And that was where it all fell apart, because I, at that point, started to look into all of the stories, the historical narrative, the context of how these experiences took place and these stories started, everything about it. By the time we got to Salt Lake City, which is like headquarters of the church, it's the spiritual center of the church, I had all but lost every belief that I ever had.
So what were you researching this on the internet or something?
Sort of. So one of the primary markers of a cult is that they tell you not to listen to anybody outside of the cult when they're talking about them. And so looking at anything that was not written by the church was forbidden, completely forbidden. So it was very difficult for me to find any information out, because of course anything that I came across was anti-Mormon. It was a lie. I could only really trust what the church was saying, except that I couldn't anymore. I kind of felt like they weren't telling me the truth either. And so this was quite a big issue. I was butting up against a situation where the people that were supposed to be telling me the truth, I didn't think were, but I couldn't find out what the actual truth was either. So I was stuck between this rock and a hard place, if you like, where I knew something wasn't right, but I didn't know what it was. I then, while we were in Salt Lake, going back about 7 years before, we'd actually had a girl come and live with us who, she was a member of the church. Her grandparents were members and they lived in America. Her parents were not members and she was struggling living at home. So she actually came to live with us and we became very close. She turned 18 while she was living with us. She then emigrated to the States and we spent a week with her while we were there and discovered that she had left the church. And I didn't place any judgment on her. She just wanted to sin, or she didn't understand, or she, you know, whatever reasons I had in my head for her leaving. I actually said to her in the car one day, I said, just give me one of your issues and ask me a question and I will answer it for you, because I know everything. Even though I didn't believe it anymore, it could only be the truth. So at some point I was going to research all of this and I was going to find the truth, right? And it was going to be that the church was true. There was no other outcome for me, even at that point. Even though I felt like it wasn't true, it all had to be true because that's the way it was. And she absolutely went for a jugular point. I don't know how she did it, but she just said to me, I don't really want to discuss it with you. I don't want to damage your testimony. I don't want to make you question anything. I was like, no, you won't. Honestly, my testimony is solid. Just ask me a question. And she said, what's the second anointing? And I was like, oh, I don't know, but I'm going to go and find out. And she said, okay, you go find out and you come and tell me what the second anointing is. And at that point, the only way to find out was to look at anti-Mormon literature. There was nothing, the church did not discuss this at all. Basically, the second anointing is given to very, very high up members of the church, very high up. We're talking the inner circle of maybe the top 15 and a few others, where they are absolved from all sin. So apart from murder, they can commit any sin they like, they can do anything they like, and they are getting to heaven. And that's given to them in the temple. I was floored by what I found. In some ways, I didn't really care about it, but what I also found was all the other websites, all the other information. There was stuff about the history sites that I just visited, and there were the actual true stories of what really happened to these people, and they were not the whitewashed versions that I'd heard, that I knew I'd heard, that I knew weren't true. And suddenly I was reading these things were making a lot more sense than what I'd been told. So yeah, that kind of happened, and I, in a sense, I guess I allowed myself the headspace to read these stories, which, and I can see why the church says not to, because it's very compelling. And so by the time we got to Los Angeles, another sort of 7 or 8 days later, I actually got to the point where I said to my husband, we were packing to come home, and I just said to him, I don't think I can go back to church when we get home, because I don't think I believe it anymore. And he was like, okay, I'm going because I believe it, and I'm taking the children with me because it's the right thing to do. You do whatever you want to do. And he completely released me from all of it with no judgment. He didn't want to know. I didn't really know anything at the time. I still didn't really know anything. Or at least that maybe I didn't know what I knew. I don't know what it was. I can't really put myself back there, because it all then becomes this intense need to make it true. So we came home. I had actually quite a high ranking position within the church. I was as high as a woman can go in the local community. And I came home and I was like, okay, look, this is just silly. Of course it's all true. I have to go back. And so I did, and I kind of put everything aside, stopped reading everything, fully focused on it all. The scrupulosity all came back. And then 2020 happened and the whole world ended for a moment. I'm actually just going to put a jumper on. I'm quite cold. Yeah, and this is where my husband joins in the journey, really. We went to Tenerife in January of 2020, so before the pandemic, and we were there for 3 weeks, and he said to me that he had wanted to know why Mormons couldn't drink coffee. And so he decided that he was going to look up why coffee was bad for you. And so he set out on this mission to find out all about why coffee was bad for you. And of course, he couldn't find anything about why coffee was bad for you, because it's not. And so he was like, okay, so what does God know that people don't know? What is, we've got 200 years worth of science here that says that coffee isn't bad for you and is actually quite good for you. So what is it that science is missing? And so he went on a bit of a dive, and we had this discussion, and I was like, well, obviously God knows more than we do, and maybe in another 200 years we're going to find out coffee's really bad for us, or whatever it is. I was still very much of that mindset at that point. He started to read some things, a bit like I'd done, where I'd found one thing that had led me to multiple other things. He then one night said to me, I read something. And I said, oh, what have you read? And he said, I read the CES letter, or I found the CES letter. I don't think he'd read it. The CES letter is a letter written by a teacher, quite a high-ranking teacher within the church. He discovered a whole series of questions, and he wrote to the CES director. CES is Church Education System. He wrote to the top guy in the church with all his questions, and then published it. And it has become the catalyst for a lot of faith transitions, because it raises so many issues. Anyway, Travis said that he'd found this document. I had heard about it. I knew it was anti-Mormon. And I was like, no, we are not even going to discuss this. And about 8 hours later, we were still up talking about it. And so, yeah, we'd been on these sort of parallel journeys, and at that point we came together and we openly discussed absolutely everything. We completely allowed ourselves freedom to read everything and anything. We threw out a lot of it, decided that it wasn't true. We came back from Tenerife, and still the pandemic was a thing in China by now. It was not global yet. So church was still continuing, so we still went to church when we came home, and yeah, we went from there. Then church was closed in March of 2020, and we were like, okay, right, this is the point at which we reset. We focus solely on the church. We take this time to do church at home, teach the children, blah 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 blah. And within about 2 weeks, we decided that we were done, and that none of it was true at all, and we could not keep teaching our children lies, whitewashed history, or anything else, and that all of the experiences that we'd had were not what we thought they were. And so, yeah, that's how we ended up here. So we had these parallel journeys, in a sense. We eventually came together, and we left together. We left actually on the same day with the same signature on the letter. So
Wow, what a journey.
so sorry, that was
Hey, yeah. Well,
that was a lot of talking.
yeah, no, well, it's absolutely fascinating, and the journey across America, you know, so much happened for you. I don't know how long were you there? How long were you in
We were
there?
there 6 weeks.
6 weeks. You know, an awful lot happened for you in those six
Yeah.
weeks. That's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and you know, I tell the story with a smile on my face. I did not smile at that
I'm
point.
sure. Yeah.
I think I cried an ocean
Mm.
actually during that time. I could not have possibly cried more. I was perpetually dehydrated with the amount of tears. The loss, the grief is incredible. That sense of loss of everything, and kind of looking at my children and going, what do I do now? I don't have a handbook anymore. And I would actually go and ask people. I would go to people and say, what do you do if your children do this? And they're like, I don't know. You mean you don't know? No, I haven't got a clue what I do if my children do that. Well, but what do I do? What am I supposed to do? Because I'd had this handbook my whole life, and suddenly we had to unpick everything. We had to unpick everything that we wanted to still do. We wanted to unpick everything that we thought we loved about the church, and somehow merge it into this new life that we had absolutely no idea how to live, and very quickly worked out that nobody does. that was actually quite freeing to realize that nobody else knows what they're doing either. That was an incredible moment. I remember sort of having that realization that nobody has a clue, and I loved that. And that we're all just sort of muddling through together. Really, nobody's got a handbook.
Yeah, and we help each other. I mean, that's the thing. Is that
Yeah, absolutely.
we've got this kind of hive mind, collective mind that,
Yeah,
and we've got instincts, and some people are better at listening to their instincts than others, and we learn from each other, and we're all making this up as we go.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah,
Absolutely.
and
Actually, oddly
and the
enough,
work.
I had a conversation with one of the children's educational psychologists today, and we were just talking about their education and what we're getting right, what we can do to support them more, and I said, so basically, what we're getting at is that we all screw up our children in our own individual ways. And she was like, yes, that's correct. That is exactly what we do.
Mm,
We all have our own unique ways of messing up and getting it right.
yeah,
And I think that's beautiful, actually. I
yeah.
think that's really,
I think things that we do that we think are really beneficial for our kids can end up being harmful. The
yeah,
things that we do which we think are neglectful are actually creating positive. You know, it's
yeah,
um, yeah. There's a famous child's developmental psychologist. I can't remember her name, and her conclusion was basically that development how it's the child develops pretty much on their own, under their own steam, um, and I see myself as a parent, as a kind of facilitator. I kind of just help them emerge, really.
Yeah.
That's how I see it. Um, I've got a lot of faith in nature, you know,
Yeah.
and kids. Wow. So, what a journey. Goodness me.
Yeah.
My
So
mind is completely blown.
I know.
Um,
Yeah. Sorry about that.
so, given we're sort of coming towards the end here, um, what's so you've touched a bit on, you know, what I was going to ask, what's life like now? Because it's still fairly recent. You know, this we're doing this
Yeah.
podcast now. It's 2023, July. It's not July, May.
No. Yeah. It could have been
Um,
July. I've got no
yeah.
idea really.
So this is pretty recent. So we're talking about the last 3 years of your
Yeah.
life, and you know what? One of the things you've touched on is that you haven't got this rule book anymore, telling you exactly what to do in all aspects of your life, what hairstyle to have, and
Yep.
not to wear black bras and things like that.
Yep. Yep.
Um,
Oh yeah, we were hussies if we wore black underwear.
yeah. So yeah, and then you know you have this, yeah, that you suddenly you're finding it's difficult as everybody to make
Yeah.
a life. Um, what are the other kind of main themes that you've experienced now in this new sense of freedom post Mormon?
The biggest thing, and I constantly, like every day, something happens where I realize that I'm free to think. And that to me has been the most incredible part of this whole journey, is that I am free to think about everything and form an opinion and change it. And I guess I have not fallen heavily anywhere. Like I don't have any really strong opinions about anything anymore. I did have. I was open to the fact that people didn't agree with me and that everybody was entitled to have whatever opinion they liked, but they were wrong and I was right. And I don't think like that anymore. That has been a very powerful part of my journey, I think, to getting to where I am now. And I can honestly say that pretty much every day something occurs where I think, oh yeah, I don't actually have to think that, or oh, actually, I am going to think that, or whatever it is. And I'm just free to think. I guess, because we can only think through the lens that we have. I can't think like a Buddhist. I can't think like an Australian or a Russian or anybody else. But I can look at what's going on around me through the lens that I have. And there are just countless, every single day, experiences where I think that person's like I was, or that situation is reflected in my experience. And I realized just how many people have these transformative experiences and how utterly devastating they are. And yet I want everybody to experience it because it's so transformative. And, you know, I look at Russia in particular and their closed system of government, their closed system of press. They're not free to think, and yet some of them are. And I love watching their stories unfold and just seeing their bravery in what they do. And I look at people, pretty much anybody who can change their mind, as being incredibly brave. And I love that about people. I love that people can do that. And so yeah, I don't feel like I've fallen heavily in any camp anymore. I don't feel like I belong anywhere, but I belong everywhere. And I really like that. So yeah, that's been a big thing for me, and allowing my children to think. has also been a big part of this, because my oldest son in particular has always been quite highly opinionated, and actually it was some of his questioning at some of the historical sites that we went to that started me questioning. So he was raising some really valid points, which I was having to excuse, make up story about, whatever it was. And so yeah, that he was quite pivotal in that in some ways. And so allowing him to then think without using those cult cliches of, well, just because it is, because the prophet says so, because that's what's written and that's how it will be done, and all those sorts of things that I would have just said naturally. I'm far more open to say I don't know. Let's go find out. Let's look at different opinions. Let's make sure that what we're reading is true. If it can't possibly be true, how can it be tested? You know, all those sorts of things. So and I love that. I love that part of my life now, that I'm just free to think about everything.
Yeah. There's a really amazing woman called Megan Phelps. I believe I'm getting that right. It's been a while ago since I engaged with her stuff, but she was part of the Westboro Baptist Church.
Okay, yeah.
And you know, she's not part of that church anymore. And for people listening, I recommend looking up her stuff, because her story, you know, is similar to yours. I really enjoyed listening to her interviews. She's done one with Sam Harris and people like that. Okay, and then so when you say that you want other people to have this experience, I know that you are now quite active working with ex-Mormons.
Yes.
Organising events and get-togethers and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And just before we recorded this, you were saying that there's a lot of ex-Mormons.
There are a lot of ex-Mormons. It's difficult to know how many, because there will be lots of people who just slip into the world. They're not interested in the ex-Mormon space. They don't need to be there. There's obviously plenty of people who come into the ex-Mormon space for a period of time and then leave. And I can't even tell you how amazing that is. They often write sort of goodbye posts, if you like, where they just go, I'm done. I'm healed. I don't need to be here anymore. And we're like, this is like the best thing ever. Just go, be free. And so yeah, we don't really know how many there are. But yeah, there's a lot, and an increasing number. We know that there's an increasing number by the fact that they are closing churches, they're selling buildings, they're merging areas of wards. So in Mormonism, the church is all sort of broken up into local areas called wards and stakes. So they're closing them all over the place. They're merging them. Yeah, all sorts of things are happening. So we can see, as a member, I could see it. I knew even as a member that sort of exodus was taking place. I cannot think that there's a single Mormon now that doesn't know an ex-Mormon who has left for theological reasons. So there are plenty of people who leave just because they never believed it, or because they were young or whatever. There's still a good number of those as well, but there is now an exceptional number of people who were fully invested in it, who are leaving for theological reasons. And I think that's quite crucial, rather than just because they're bored or they don't want to be there anymore. And while it's easy to write that off, and most Mormons would write me off as that I was offended, or somebody told my mum the other day that I was upset about the money. Like, you can be more wrong. I don't care about the money. I couldn't care less about the money, because there's been a big thing recently that the church has $150 billion in its bank account. And so, yeah, I posted about that on Facebook, and suddenly that was the reason I left.
Yeah.
I could not care less about the money, for the record. If anyone's listening, I don't care that they have money. I don't care what they do. They should, but that's a different matter. I didn't leave for that reason. And I think that's really crucial, that there is this growing number of people that are recognizing that it's not true, that it is damaging, and they are then leaving.
I think,
and I doubt there's a Mormon.
I imagine the internet has a lot to do with that.
A huge amount.
Yeah, I think a lot of these kind of large cults that have been around for a long time are just no match for contact with the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I also think that there's this big drive, isn't there, for how do you know if something is true? So I can remember doing that with the children when they were quite young as a member. And of course, when it's to do with the church, then it's just because it's true. If it was anything else, like they'll come across stuff on Reddit. And I'm like, okay, so how do you know that that's a true story? Well, because it's also on the BBC website. Okay, so you've looked it up. That's great. You carry on doing that then, and that's okay. So yeah, there's a lot of those sorts of conversations taking place, and I think people are using those critical thinking skills far more than they used to, because they have to. You know, we all get the scam phone calls.
Yeah.
We all get the scam emails. We've got to decide: have we actually won £50,000 Argos voucher? It's unlikely, isn't it? So let's just check that one out before responding or whatever. And so I think naturally we're all doing that all of the time. So I guess that then is going to impact what you believe. And you hear something at church that's just so extraordinary, you're then going to go, okay, where's the evidence? And that's obviously a big thing. Anybody making an extraordinary claim has to have extraordinary evidence.
Yeah.
And churches don't. It's just so I can separate out faith and belief from truth. And I do think there's a place for belief. People want to believe in a God. I have no issues with that at all. People telling me that that's the only truth with no evidence, that's not okay. And I think that's kind of a new place for me to be in as well. Yeah. And again, I guess why I don't really sit strongly in any position anymore, because I don't know that I will ever really know the truth of anything anymore. And that's okay. I'm quite happy with that situation.
Yeah, but it's one of the oldest insights of the sages and mystics of all time, is that the more you develop through life, the more you realize you don't actually know anything.
Yeah, that's right.
And that's okay.
Yeah, it is. It is okay. And I've often said it's a bit, there is an absolute truth to everything, but we are rarely going to find out what that is. So, for example, it could be raining or not outside my window. There's an absolute truth to that, and I can go and find that out by going and looking outside of my window. You're 20 minutes up the road from me. It might be raining here, not raining there. So I couldn't then tell you that it's raining outside your window. You would have to go and find that absolute truth for yourself. And it's testable and it's repeatable. And I can always look outside the window and I can always find out if it's raining. With faith, you actually can't do that. And therefore, I don't see that I have to have it. And I don't see that even if there was a God, that I would have to believe in something that I can't test and prove. Of course, as a member, I would have said that I can test it and prove it. But that's a different matter, isn't it? Now, I don't think that. But yeah, I think there's an absolute truth. We're either going to live after we die or we're not. There's an absolute truth to that. And I don't know what that is. And I'm probably erring on the idea that I'm never going to find out.
Well, because we're all destined to find out one day when we die.
If we just die and nothing exists, then we're never going to know.
Yeah.
But there will still be an absolute truth. And I actually almost find that more exciting than I ever found this idea of this sort of eternal, either joy with no pain, no suffering, eternal sort of baby making and family making, and just forever and ever and ever doing one thing with no opposition, or an eternity of damnation and burning and misery. I actually quite like the fact that I'm never going to know, or if I do know, that it's going to be something much better than anything that's currently on the table.
Yeah, I think reading some of the near-death experience literature can really help one feel a
It's
bit better
fascinating.
about dying.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I think I'm a lot less fearful of it now. I don't have that. So I don't know whether it's common across religious belief, but this kind of idea that there's going to be this live action role play of our lives on a big screen in front of the whole world, and everyone's going to know exactly what we did, and yeah, all that kind of stuff. I don't have that fear anymore. And I just think that's actually really quite freeing, not to have that worry anymore. Quite like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, we've been going on a long time, and I think we should wrap it up. But we haven't touched on. You did a course with what's the guy's name? Steven Hassan.
Yeah.
Yeah, who was an ex-Moon. He was a Moonie, and he's an ex-Moonie, and he now has dedicated his life to working with people who have come out of cults, and that's very interesting. I mean, there's a whole nother conversation there. Maybe we'll have that one another time.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
And you're also going to be starting a degree of the psychology of coercive control.
That's correct.
Which you haven't started yet, but
I have not.
when you get into that course, perhaps we could have another conversation about that.
Yeah, and I think I do think that's going to be really interesting. And one of the big aspects of that is supporting people coming out of those coercive, controlling environments. And a huge amount of Steven Hassan's work is around the fact that you cannot do it for somebody else. And in fact, you have to be quite careful how you deal with people that are in those high demand groups or relationships, because these cults can be one person led cults. You can kind of get yourself into your own cult if you like. And I guess to a certain extent, maybe we're all, like you said at the beginning, we're all actually vulnerable to that. And one of my biggest realizations, I guess, for now, is that I am still vulnerable to that because I'm a human being.
Yeah, I watched some documentaries on Scientology a while back. Louis Theroux did one, and there's another one called it's just escaped me. So the whole thing's on YouTube. It's a brilliant like 2-hour-long documentary about Scientology. And I remember when I was looking at it, I was Going Clear. That's the name of the documentary on YouTube.
Okay, yeah.
Going Clear. Really recommend people watch that. And I remember looking at it, and I was a lot of the people into Scientology are really successful, intelligent people. Really successful in the world. They're obviously accomplished people.
Yeah.
And they're not stupid or idiots and that kind of thing. And I was thinking about things I've done in my life, ideas that have consumed me for periods of my life, and different groups that I've become close to, or kind of been on the periphery and looked in, or other groups I know about. And if you take the Scientology or the Mormon brand off it and just look at the structure of that way of being, that kind of worldview, and just honestly start to look at your own life and those around you, it's really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, actually, one of the very first places I went when I was kind of very early on was XJW on Reddit.
That's Jehovah's Witnesses.
Jehovah's Witnesses, that's correct. And I went there first. So there is a huge ex-Mormon Reddit, which I absolutely recommend to everybody to go and read. Just go read like the first top the hot posts or something. It's just incredible, the stories that come out of that. And also they tend to be quite funny. But yeah, the ex-JWs, I was reading through their stories and I was thinking, well, this sounds really familiar. It's different words, but the same language. And I understood every single emotion, every experience that they were talking about, even though the words were different. And it suddenly occurred to me that we couldn't all be leaving the one true church. They couldn't be leaving the one true church because Mormonism was, but they thought the same thing about us. So yeah, that was hugely freeing. And actually Steven Hassan talks a lot about how cult survivors should speak, should find their voices, because often in cults your voice is silenced and you're not able to share your thoughts and opinions quite as openly. And so yeah, people who are leaving cults, high demand groups, abusive relationships, coercive controlling environments should speak out, because it's the way to try and prevent other people going in. You can't release people from those environments, but you can try and prevent yourself and other people from falling into it again. And I think reading Steven Hassan's bite model is invaluable to the world. I think everybody should read that. It's not the definitive work. There are other things out there as well, but it's a really nice sort of succinct way of looking at groups and whether or not they're healthy or unhealthy. It's quite difficult to see. If you're invested in something, it can be quite difficult to look at it critically, but I think that's also really important. So yeah, all those sorts of things. I think it's just about thinking and not judging yourself too harshly. You're not stupid if you become entrapped by these groups. Often they prey on human vulnerability. So they'll get you at a point where maybe you've lost your job, or your relationship isn't quite as good, or you've had a bereavement, whatever it is, where you're just feeling vulnerable, those groups can pick you up. And that can be therapy groups. You've mentioned meditation or yoga groups. They can pick you up and promise you this endlessly better world. And of course, nobody can actually do that because life just sucks. And sometimes you just have to work your way through those things. And there are other ways. There are healthy ways of working through all of those crises in life without needing somebody to come along and just make it all better for you.
Yeah.
I think that's really important.
Yeah, wise words. So just as we finish, are there any other places you would point people to, or any other thing you think is important that you want to just share as we close?
I guess if there's any post-Mormons listening, they'll already know where to go for support, because if they found you, then they'll have found those other additional supports. I think talking is really important. I've actually got myself to a place now where I get less involved in the conversation. So I don't need to consistently hear that the church isn't true anymore. I'm not angry anymore either. That's also been huge. I was angry for probably 2 years, and it was all consuming at times during that period of time, where I could barely breathe at times because I was so angry. I wanted to go and just set fire to everything and watch it all burn. And the anger, it's very uncomfortable feeling. I now recognize it as being a very positive feeling, because I never want to feel it again. Besides anything else, I never want to feel that anger again. So it's almost like a protective barrier around myself now, because I don't want to go back to that place. And I'm not angry anymore. I get annoyed by things sometimes if I get sucked back into a story, but it doesn't last very long. And I like that place. And I think anybody who's early in their journey, they can take heart that happens. That process happens and peace comes. And yeah, you do eventually find yourself in a different place again. I don't know if it's better or worse. I think life's just life. And yeah, I think we just, like you say, we all help each other through. I think that's really important, which is why Steven Hassan says to talk about it, because we can help each other through those mediums. So yeah, really important.
Kathryn, thank you so much for sharing your amazing story with anyone listening to this and watching, and myself. It's been such an eye opener for me, all of that, and I admire your courage and generosity to want to speak out, as you say, and share this with people. And I hope it helps many people. And if it's on the internet, hopefully it's there for a long time and potentially could help lots of people break free from whatever they're stuck in. So
yeah,
that's my hope.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been good. Thank you.
I made all the music that I use in my podcasts. If you'd like to hear more of my music, please visit SoundCloud and check out my profile, Ralph Cree.